International law's role in modern diplomacy. International law and diplomacy are two fundamental concepts intertwined in the conduct of foreign relations, sharing the core idea of interactions between nations. In the modern world, marked by unprecedented global interconnectedness and complex shared challenges like climate change and human rights violations, international law stands as the cornerstone, weaving together the principles and norms that govern these interactions. Diplomacy, as an instrument of statecraft, relies heavily on a rules-based system to facilitate negotiations, resolve disputes, and foster international cooperation. The role of international law in modern diplomacy is thus indispensable, providing the foundational structure, defining legitimate behavior, guiding new forms of engagement, and offering pathways for dispute resolution in a system often characterized by competing national interests. The interplay between international law and diplomacy is dynamic and recurrent, with the primacy of international law in interstate engagements generally considered axiomatic. However, an apparent tension exists. Diplomacy typically relies on compromise and flexibility, while law is premised on hierarchy and rules. International law functions not to transform the political system or to disguise it, but rather to provide states with an instrument for achieving a tentative reconciliation between their simultaneous urges for freedom of action and the need for predictable patterns of behavior. International law provides the necessary structure, enabling diplomatic practice by defining the rights and obligations states articulate to one another. Its sources are heavily influenced by state action, primarily derived from international conventions and customary international law. Consequently, states actively shape the legal yardstick for acceptable international behavior during treaty negotiations. The modern relevance of international law is tied to the current global landscape, where the actions of one nation can have reverberating effects worldwide. International law is integral to global governance, helping to maintain order and coherence. Diplomats and officials must possess adequate knowledge of international law and national interests to ensure foreign policy positions are formulated and delivered consistently with international obligations, supporting the enduring interests of the state in the continuing evolution of international law. The role of international law is most explicitly evident in the framework governing traditional diplomatic interactions, largely codified by the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations establishes that the purpose of diplomatic privileges and immunities is not to benefit individuals, but to ensure the efficient performance of the functions of diplomatic missions as representatives of states. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations outlines the core functions of a diplomatic mission, including representing the sending state in the receiving state, protecting the interests of the sending state and its nationals, within the limits permitted by international law. 3. Negotiating with the government of the receiving state. 4. Ascertaining conditions and developments in the receiving state by all lawful means. Promoting friendly relations and developing economic, cultural, and scientific relations. Furthermore, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations institutionalizes the legal protections necessary for diplomats to operate effectively. The person of a diplomatic agent is inviolable. They are not liable to any form of arrest or detention, and the receiving state must take appropriate steps to prevent attacks on their person, freedom, or dignity. This inviolability also extends to the diplomatic agent's private residence. However, this legal status comes with corresponding duties, primarily the obligation for all persons enjoying such privileges and immunities to respect the laws and regulations of the receiving state, and the duty not to interfere in the internal affairs of that state. The establishment of diplomatic missions and relations between states operates fundamentally by mutual consent. Even compliance mechanisms like the enforcement of Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations norms rely on diplomatic means, such as the mechanism of tit-for-tat retaliation, reciprocity, which involves the receiving state requiring that the mission size be kept within reasonable limits or expelling mission members without explanation. Modern diplomacy faces increasing competition and challenges from technological progress, globalization, and the emergence of new actors beyond sovereign states, such as NGOs, the business community, and specialized international organizations. International law helps to navigate this complex environment by providing a normative framework for these evolving forms of engagement. One significant development is public diplomacy, which focuses on influencing foreign publics, presenting and explaining policies, and managing communication strategies. The question of the legal framework for public diplomacy is pertinent. Relevant principles are found in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which articulates norms of intellectual freedom and unrestricted access to information. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights principle requires factuality and benignity in spreading knowledge. However, the conduct of modern diplomacy, including public diplomacy activity, is constrained by the international legal order, particularly Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the UN Charter, which prohibits intervention in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. This principle of non-intervention provides a normative justification for resistance to outside influences and pressures. Furthermore, international law is crucial in guiding diplomatic efforts related to pressing global challenges. The fields of law regulating defense, security, environment, and human rights now define core areas of modern diplomatic activity. Diplomacy is called upon to search not for the balance of power, but for the balance of interest, seeking compromise solutions to channel global changes in a rule-based manner. The concept of international law is essential for promoting and protecting human rights globally, establishing accountability for perpetrators of serious violations, and underscoring the international community's duty to prevent mass atrocities. A primary role of international law in diplomacy is facilitating the peaceful settlement of international disputes. The vast majority of disputes are settled by negotiation. International law provides established methods, including legal methods such as arbitration and courts, and diplomatic methods such as negotiation, mediation, conciliation, and investigation. The Philippines, for instance, has demonstrated its faith in international institutions by actively resorting to dispute mechanisms under international law, such as the South China Sea arbitration case under the Permanent Court of Arbitration. International law functions as an instrument to enhance specific demands and agendas with political struggles, affirming that the task of international law is a relatively autonomous formal technique. Its mechanisms promote cooperation, ensuring an agreed set of rules exists to handle complex international relations, rather than relying purely on a trial of strength between states. When diplomats engage in negotiations, they are expected to appeal not to the general feelings of moral rightness, but to precedents, to treaties, and to opinions of specialists, assuming the existence of legal obligations. Despite the challenges of enforcement due to the lack of an apex international authority or courts with compulsory jurisdiction, the effectiveness of international law persists because states understand its political significance. States are keen to be seen as acting consistently with their legal obligations and utilize international law to strengthen their positions, situating their policies and preferences as consistent with international norms. The willingness to comply, even when self-serving, is powerful because non-compliance is viewed negatively, making the presentation of compliance the default self-interpretation of state behavior. International law is fundamental to modern diplomacy, providing the legal foundations for stability, defining legitimacy, and creating the processes through which states, and increasingly non-state actors, conduct foreign relations. From codifying the rights and duties of diplomats under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations to offering pathways for dispute resolution via the ICJ, and establishing the normative basis for addressing global issues like human rights and environmental protection, international law is the medium within which diplomacy operates. While the practice of diplomacy itself involves compromise and the pursuit of national interests, international law ensures that this pursuit occurs within a shared, evolving framework of principles, contributing significantly to a more just, equitable, and cooperative global order. It is the constant invocation and interpretation of these legal resources that keeps the diplomatic dialogue coherent, proving that in modern international relations, the art of the possible is inherently bounded by the constraints and opportunities provided by international law.